Hi, this is David, the head of the reading writing section here at Qube. Today I have the pleasure of going over test 1 with you guys. So without further ado, let's start from question 1. So, question 1 is a word and context question. We know that with every test that we start on the digital SAT reading section, we always start with word and context questions. Now, there are two kinds of word and context questions. So, of those two, we have what are called blank word and context questions and underlined word and context questions. And so, blank questions are essentially where we have some sort of blank in the passage. We need to find what fits best in the blank. Underlined questions is when a word is underlined within the passage and we have to find the best replacement for that question. Here we're dealing with a blank question, and so what we need to do is pick out of A, B, C, and D what would be most natural in context. Now, if we look at our answer choices here, we see that they are all adjectives. And so with adjectives, what we want to do is look for any tone words or words that would describe Sir Richard Hamilton that could give us a good idea of what kind of word we're trying to find in respect to his demeanor. So let's highlight some tone words here. So first of all, we see that he's a seasoned diplomat and that he has over 3 decades of experience in international affairs. And he also has an adept ability to navigate labyrinth negotiations and has knowledge of international relations. So if this is true, we know first of all that we're looking for a positive word. Now the question is, what kind of positive word are we actually looking for? So we look first at A, abrasive. Abrasive is a negative word, right? Abrasive means in this case rude, which can't be the answer, right? So we can eliminate A. Gregarious, which means friendly, might be the answer, but let's see if in the passage we have any indication of him being friendly. We don't, so we can eliminate B. Now we're between C and D now. Let's look at D first. So D is capricious. And so what does capricious mean? It means easily changing or fickle, right? And so is there any indication that his behavior changes over time? And there isn't, so we can eliminate D. And we're left with judicious, which means good judgment, right? Someone who expresses good judgment. And so in order to be a seasoned diplomat and have all of these high stakes discussions, he must have had to express good judgment, making in this case C the answer. Now we're going to move on to number 2. So with number 2, we're dealing with another word and context question. This time, if we look at the options, we know that we're dealing with verbs. And so if we're dealing with verbs, now what we want to do is identify what verb would be most natural in context here. And so when we're dealing with verbs, it's best to first identify what is the subject of the sentence in question. And so we see that it says, his work seemed to blank the confines of conventional wisdom. In this case, our subject would be work, and then we want to find what our object is. And so our object in this sentence would be confines of conventional wisdom. So his work seemed to blank the confines of conventional wisdom. We can also look for hints in other sentences. And so when we look at other sentences, we see that his sophistication and emotional depth belied his age. So he did things that were beyond his age, right? And so we want to say something along the lines of the fact that his work went above the confines of a conventional wisdom, right? So now let's look at the answer choices. And first we have transgress. So transgress basically means to sin, right? And so that can't make sense or violate some sort of thing. Corroborate, which means to prove or confirm, wouldn't make sense either because his work doesn't corroborate conventional wisdom. It goes above it, right? So confirm or corroborate wouldn't work. And then adhere, which means to listen to or stick to, wouldn't make sense because, again, it goes beyond conventional wisdom, and so we can eliminate C here. So adhere, I'll say listen to. And so we're left with transcend, which basically means to go above and beyond, right? And so as a result, we can pick transcend as our answer here, making D the answer. Okay, so now that we're done with the word and context questions, now we're moving on to what is called a function question. And so function question is one of the many craft and structure types of questions that are tested on this test. Function questions involve us looking at sentences and determining what the role of a particular sentence is here. And so when we look at this particular passage, what we want to first do is read the intro part. And so it says, the following text is adapted from Nathaniel Hawthorne's 1850 novel, The Scarlet Letter. Hester Prynne, a woman who has been punished for adultery, is out in public. So we know that she's punished, right? Which is actually going to be a good indication and will help us answer the question in the future. So when we first look at a function question, what we want to do is read the sentences before and after the sentence that's underlined here. And so the sentence before reads that her attire seemed to express the attitude of her spirit and had this picturesque peculiarity and wildness to it, right? And so that's what we want to infer, what we want to gather from the sentence beforehand. And then the sentence afterwards says it had the effect of a spell, right? So we can immediately tell that something being peculiar versus something having the effect of a spell is slightly different points, right? So then let's read the underlined sentence now. It says, the point which drew all eyes, as it were, transfigured the wearer, so that both men and women who had been familiarly acquainted with Hester Prynne were now impressed as if they beheld her for the first time, was that scarlet letter, so fantastically embroidered and illuminated upon her bosom. So we know that this underlined sentence is a little bit different from the sentence beforehand, given the fact that the sentence beforehand, first of all, talks about just her peculiarity. And then we see that with this function underlined sentence, that it has but, which is key to helping us infer the answer. So there must be some sort of contrast with the previous sentence. And then we know that the scarlet letter made people impressed as if they beheld her for the first time. And so her attire in general is unique, but the scarlet letter has this different impact, right? So when we look at the answers, let's look first at A. It provides a detailed depiction of a character's attire and beauty, enhancing the scene's imagery. So, in terms of talking about her attire in general, the sentence before the underlined sentence actually has more of that role. But the sentence that's in question is talking about more specifically her scarlet letter rather than her attire in general. And so that's why we can eliminate A. I'm going to skip down to C now. It subtly casts doubt on the claim made in the preceding sentence, prompting further scrutiny. So there's not necessarily doubt that comes out in this sentence. That it's more of just a shift in the discussion rather than doubt. And so that's why we can eliminate C. D, it effectively expands on the premise introduced in the previous sentence, adding depth to the narrative. So, does it expand on the premise that was introduced in the previous sentence? It's not so much talking about her attire as and talking about her peculiarity as much as it's introducing this scarlet letter and this profound effect it has on people. And so that's why you can eliminate D. And we're left with B. So it underscores a marked shift in perception with that's what we can infer purely by but, and then illustrating the transformative effect of a symbol. And so the fact that it says this scarlet letter, right, which is the symbol in question, impressed her, right, impressed people and made it feel like they were beholding her for the first time. That's the transformative effect of this symbol that's being discussed. And so as a result, we can pick B as our answer here. So now moving on to number 4. 4, we're dealing with another function question, this time nonfiction. And so again, we want to read the sentences before and after. And so this nonfiction function question is rather short, but it reads, a research study by a group of scientists, including biologist Sarah R. Johnson, indicates that the presence of certain bird species can affect the growth rate of nearby plants. The researchers studied the effect of various bird species on the growth of understory plants in different forest ecosystems by monitoring bird visits and plant growth. The team discovered that in some cases, plants grew faster when specific bird species were more frequent visitors. So this is just a classic science passage, right? Where essentially we start off with some sort of hypothesis. Or in this case, more so than a hypothesis, it's like an argument that's being discussed. And then what we have is some sort of process that's being discussed. Let me write this again. And then we end with some sort of result. And so this is just the normal order in which we talk about these science passages. And this can obviously vary per science passage. But so in this case, what we want to do is we want to identify this underlined sentence, what the effect is. And we see that they're studying the effect of various bird species on the growth of understory plants in different forest ecosystems by monitoring bird visits and plant growth, right? So what we're essentially talking about is the process by which they came to the results they did. And so when we look at the options, it's not to establish a correlation, so we can eliminate A. It's not to justify why we picked a particular species, so we can eliminate B. To provide an example of a particular bird species influencing plant growth. Do they provide a particular example in the sentence? No. So we're left with to describe the approach or process used in the research study to gather data on, so we can pick D as our answer here. So let's move on now to number 5. So this is what we call the paired passage question, or cross-text, as it's officially known as. And so what we need to do is we need to read text 1 and text 2 and try to, in this case, talk about how text 2 would respond to the perspective put in text 1. And so not always do we see these cross-text connection questions always having to do with how text 2 would respond to text 1. It could be what point do they disagree or agree on. So there are slight variations to this kind of question, but in this case we're dealing with purely how would text 2 think about the perspective put forth in text 1. And so what we can do to sort of expedite the process in which we solve something like this is if we can find in text 2 a sentence that specifically references text 1, it's a lot easier to solve the question. And so in looking at text 2, there's a sentence that says, acknowledging the structural complexity of the cortex, her research tends to underscore a distinct yet interrelated aspect of this part of the brain. Her study focuses on the biochemical processes and signaling pathways in the cortex. So, in general, text 1 is talking about a particular structural element, and specifically the high density of neurons in the cortex, as well as the intricate labyrinth web of connections, whereas text 2 is talking about the biochemical processes. But the important part of this is the fact that in text 2 acknowledges that structural complexity is important, and that the structural intricacies discussed in text 1 do actually influence things. So we want to pick something that's along the lines of somewhat agreeing with text 1. In looking at A, B, C, and D, we can immediately eliminate C and D, given the fact that C is disregarding and D is arguing that it's outdated. So we can eliminate C and D and we're left with either A or B. And so in this case, the reason why B is not right is she wouldn't completely agree with text 1. If B said by partially agreeing, then B could be a potential answer, but it's not a complete agreement, so we can eliminate B. And we're left with A. By appreciating its relevance, but suggests that it lacks a detailed consideration of the biochemical processes in the cortex, which is discussed in text 2. So I'm moving on to number 6. So 6 is what we have called a quotation claim question, where essentially we have some sort of claim put forth in the paragraph, and we need to find a quote that would support the claim. And so the claim in question is, the character of Prospero demonstrates a change of heart when he decides to give up his magical powers. So we need to make sure that every part of the quotation in question references all of these ideas, right? Not only a change of heart, but when he gives up his magical powers. And so it's also important to look at who the character is talking about when they give the claim. So let's read A. Tells Miranda, "Oh, wonder how many goodly creatures there are here." Is this any sort of change of heart? No, and so we can eliminate A. What about B? Speaks to Ariel, "Our revels now are ended. These are actors. We're all spirits and are melted into air, into thin air." So they're talking about some sort of spirit being melted into air, but is this deliberately giving up his magical powers? And is it a change of heart? No, and so we can eliminate B. Looking at C here, proclaims to the spirits, "I'll break my staff, bury it certain fathoms in the earth, and deeper than did ever plummet sound, I'll drown my book." So we can see deliberate actions here, and it's proclaiming to the spirits, right? So he's going to break his staff, which potentially has some sort of magical powers, and burying it in the earth, right? And drowning his book. So this all has to do with things that he originally believed were associated with magic, giving up on them, and having this sort of change of heart, which allows us to pick C as the answer. Why is D wrong? D says, confronts Caliban, a born devil, on whose nature nurture can never stick. There's no change of heart here, allowing us to eliminate D and pick C as our answer. Okay, so now we have an overall structure of the text question. And so with overall structure of the text questions, like main idea or main purpose, we can see them in poems, nonfiction, and fiction passages. Here we have a poem, and so what we want to do here is first look at the poem itself. And so when we look at the poem, we see that it's talking about the swinging of these birch trees, right? And so these birch trees, the narrator talks about thinking it's like some boy's been swinging on them, but swinging doesn't bend them down to stay, as ice storms do. And then he compares them to ice storms, right? So the actual reason why they're bending is because of ice storms, but he imagines this playful sort of explanation in terms of a boy having swung on them. And so when we look at the options here, we want to pick something along those lines, given the fact that overall structure is talking about from start to finish, what are we talking about here? And so let's just start with D. And so the speaker admires the landscape and ponders the interplay of light and darkness in nature. There's no mention of light nor darkness in this piece, and so we can eliminate D as our answer. Now looking at C, the speaker discusses the resilience of birch trees and contemplates the ephemeral nature of beauty. Okay, so we might have an argument in favor of the resilience of birch trees. Now the problem here is the fact that he never contemplates the ephemeral or short-lived nature of beauty, allowing us to pick C as the answer. To eliminate C as the answer. And then we have B, which says, the speaker describes the destructive forces of nature, then laments the loss of childhood innocence. There's no mention of childhood innocence in him regretting or missing the loss of childhood innocence, so we can eliminate B. And we're left with A. The speaker observes the bending of birch trees, then imagines a playful explanation for their curvature or the boy swinging on them. And so as a result, we can pick A as our answer. Okay, so we have another poem here. So this is a function poem. And so what we have here is the last lines being underlined. The echoes bound to a joyful sound, but shrink from voicing care. With this question, you'll see that there's contrasts throughout the piece. So the first line reads, laugh and the world laughs with you, weep and you weep alone. And so whenever we engage in some sort of collective happy emotion, everybody's with you, but when we are sad, you're essentially alone. And this is also clear in the underlined sentence in saying the echoes bound to a joyful sound, right? The echoes meaning the sound reverberates back, right? But shrink from voicing care. So there's more of a sound or more of a collective feeling associated with joy. and less so with sadness, or in this case, voicing care or concern. And so when we look at the various answers here, this would match with C in saying it delineates or shows the world's inclination to engage in collective mirth. So collective mirth meaning collective happiness rather than shared sorrow or sadness. And so that's why we pick C here. In terms of the other options being wrong, if we look at A, it says acknowledges happiness as the core human emotion experienced in nature. So while this passage does talk about happiness, it also talks about sadness, which A is essentially missing, and those lines specifically talk about shrinking from voicing care. So A would not fit the role of the lines underlined. It understates the shared resonance of joy and its ubiquity in nature. Again, it's only talking about joy here, and so we can eliminate B. It reinforces the speaker's conviction in the resounding nature of joy and sorrow. This doesn't talk about his conviction or confidence in this fact, and so as a result, we can eliminate D, leaving us with C as the answer. Okay, so now we have a support the text question where essentially what we need to do is look at the argument made in the text and then find some sort of evidence that would support that argument. And so here they actually tell us what claim that's being discussed, because sometimes there can be multiple claims within the passage itself. And so here we see that they talk about the claim being that honeybee dance is a sophisticated form of communication. And so if that's the case here, we want to essentially pick something that has to do with that honeybee dance is a sophisticated form of communication, but how is it sophisticated? Let's look if we can find any sort of evidence in the text. And it says the dance comprises specific movements and vibrations that provide information about the direction and distance of the food source. So depending on how the honeybees dance, there's going to be different information conveyed about the direction and distance. And so we want to find something that is along those lines. And so when we look at A first, it says honeybees are social insects that live in large colonies with a complex division of labor. Does this have anything to do with communication? No, so we can eliminate A. Let's look at B. The honeybee dance has been decoded by scientists who discovered that the angle of the dance relative to gravity indicates the direction of the food source, while the duration of the dance indicates the distance. So this gives us a good indication of how they use the dance to communicate the direction and distance, making B the answer. Let's look at C and D, why they're wrong. So C says honeybees have a remarkable ability to learn and remember the location of multiple food sources, allowing them to optimize their foraging efforts and maximize the resources available to the colony. So honeybees, it has nothing to do again with their communication, allowing us to eliminate C. And so D, the honeybee dance is not unique to one species of honeybee, but has been observed in multiple species. So sure, it does mention the word communication here and saying that's an effective form of communication, but it doesn't say how do they actually communicate, allowing us to eliminate D as our answer, leaving us with B as the answer. Okay, so now we're moving on to a table question. And so we have two types of table questions, which I'll discuss real quick. So of table and graph questions, they can either be support weekend based, or they can be completing some sort of statement or example. And so here we have a support weekend type of graph question. So let's look at what the actual argument that's being made is. And it says, Dr. Wright, however, suggested that while there is an apparent increase in the number of awards, early on, this increase in the number of awards did not necessarily correlate with a rise in the quality of literature, which he measured using average critical ratings. So what we want to do is make a test hypothesis here. And so what we could say is award number does not necessarily translate to what we could say. It doesn't necessarily translate to an increase in critical ratings. I'm just going to label it CR. So what we're essentially saying is that an increase in number of words doesn't necessarily increase in a critical ratings. And so what I'll do here is put that this is not equal to an average critical rating increase. And so what we want to do is not support this conclusion, but actually weaken it. And so we want to find something that says the number of awards going up. So something with higher critical ratings actually does elicit more rewards. And so we want to find, to weaken this conclusion, this relationship, right? And so if that's true, let's find something that essentially says early on, right? So we want to look at only these years, because this is early on, that when the critical rating went up, there was an increase in the number of literary awards. And there's only one statement within A, B, and C and D that would agree with this. And that's D, because it says from the 1960s and 1970s, the number of literary awards rose by 5, and critical rating increased by 1.9, allowing us to pick D as the answer. As for why the other ones are not right, A talks about the 1990s, which is not early on. 2010s and 1960s would not be discussing necessarily early on, because 2010s is not early on, so we can eliminate B as well. Again, C is not discussing early on either, and so we can eliminate C. So even having the simple language of early on allowed us to eliminate a lot of questions here. A lot of the answers here, allowing us to pick D as our answer. Okay. So moving on to number 11 here. Again, we have a support weaken kind of graph question, but here we have support rather than weaken, right? So what we want to do first is identify what is the conclusion. And the conclusion reads, while all woods showed changes in sound velocity over the time analyzed, certain woods displayed more pronounced increases as a result of density changes. So there are actually two parts of this support graph question. So the first is that all woods showed changes. And then the second part is that certain woods displayed more pronounced increases. And that's in sound velocity. So bigger velocity changes. Okay. And so we want to make sure that our answer would address both parts of this claim. And so we look at A. It says mahogany showed the most significant change in sound velocity, indicating its greater sensitivity to environmental changes. So that would address number 2, but not number 1, allowing us to eliminate A. What about B? All of the woods observed a change in velocity, but only maple, oak, ash, and spruce observed density changes. We're concerned with velocity changes, not density changes, allowing us to eliminate B. What about C? None of the wood types observed a velocity change of less than 100 meters per second, and maple observed the greatest change in sound velocity when considering woods that underwent density changes. So in saying none of the woods observed a velocity change of less than 100 meters per second, it's acknowledging that all woods showed a change in velocity, right? While also pointing out that maple observed the greatest change in sound velocity, satisfying both number 1 and number 2 parts of our claim, and making us pick number C. As to why D doesn't make sense, D reads, none of the wood types observed a velocity change of less than 100 meters per second, and maple observed the greatest change in sound velocity when considering woods. Oh, sorry, I read C again. D says maple displayed the least significant velocity change, and oak displayed the greatest velocity change when examining woods that underwent density changes. And so they talked about velocity changes here, but not the fact that all woods showed changes in velocity, allowing us to pick to eliminate D as our answer and leaving us with C that we can pick. Okay, so now moving on to number 12. With number 12, we're dealing with another support table question. And so we want to look at what the hypothesis is in this case. And so the hypothesis reads that even subtle increases in the population growth rate can cause dramatic increases in urbanization rates, contributing to a significant reduction in green space area rates. So subtle increases in the population growth can cause dramatic increases in urbanization rates and would allow green space areas to also fall, right? And so when we look at the various answers here, A says that city C1's green space area is more than double C2's urbanization rate, but it doesn't discuss population growth rate subtle increases, and so we can eliminate A as our answer. What about B? B actually does the opposite of what we want because it says that the growth rate between city C4 and city C1 is not subtle, so it would disagree with our claim. What about C? City 3 experienced a much higher urbanization rate and smaller green space area than City C2 despite the relatively subtle difference in their population growth rates. If we look at C2 and City C3, we can see that there was only a 0.1 increase in population growth, but urbanization rate doubled and green space went down, therefore satisfying our conclusion. If we look at D, City C5 with the highest population growth also has the highest urbanization rate and the smallest amount of green space. This does not, again, discuss subtle increases in the population growth rate, allowing us to eliminate D as our answer and leaving us with C. Okay, so now we have a table question that is the other kind of question where we have to complete a statement that's made. And so when we look at this kind of question, we want to make sure that we understand exactly what this passage is talking about. And so they talk about the fact that an increase in CO2 levels can lead to ocean acidification, which negatively affects marine organisms such as coral reefs, mollusks, and some species of plankton. And so we should expect that as atmospheric CO2 increases, that oceanic CO2 concentration or acidification should increase as well. And so when we look at the answer choices, the researchers posited that blank. A reads the increase in the atmospheric CO2 concentration between time period A and time period D. So we see that atmospheric was from 280 to 370, may have had a significant impact on marine ecosystems due to ocean acidification. We can see that oceanic CO2 concentration also went up by 200 over that period, allowing us to pick A as the answer. Now, why do the other ones not make sense? If we read B, first of all, it says, the difference in oceanic CO2 concentration between time period A and time period B might not have been significant enough to affect marine organisms. This would weaken our conclusion rather than strengthen it, allowing us to eliminate B. What about C? The relatively stable oceanic CO2 concentration between time period B and time period C could indicate a period of reduced impact on marine ecosystems. Again, we don't want stable, we want an increase. So we can eliminate C as an answer. Finally, leaving us with D. The substantial increase in atmospheric CO2 concentration between time period B and time period C could have led to a more rapid decline in the health of marine ecosystems. So let's look at time period B versus C. And during period B versus C, there was an increase of 10, which is not more rapid than the other period. So because it disagrees with the graph, we can eliminate D as our answer, leaving us with A. Okay, so before we move on to a grammar section on any sort of reading and writing module, we know that we are always going to end on what are logically complete questions. And so in this case, this logically complete question reads, despite constituting a modest fraction of the audiences at public speeches, skilled rhetoricians, or in this case we're talking about people who are skilled speakers, tend to exert a disproportionate influence over crowd reactions. A likely rationale for this skewed influence might be that seasoned orators, or again, skilled rhetoricians and seasoned orators are the same thing here, understand the nuances of persuasive communication, and their grasp of these subtleties could blank. Okay. So there are two kinds of logically complete questions. One is called inductive reasoning, and the other is called deductive reasoning. And so generally on the SAT, around 90+% of the logically complete questions are going to be inductive reasoning. And so what is inductive reasoning? It's where we have a series of facts leading to some sort of conclusion. What is deductive reasoning? It's the opposite. It's where we have a conclusion supported by facts that then appear. And so the question is, how do we know when something's inductive? If we see some sort of language like this suggests that, therefore, this could do this, then we know that we're talking about some sort of conclusion that's appearing last. If we see language like the reason for this is because of, that is going to be deductive reasoning. And so when we look at the passage itself, we see that it says their grasp of these subtleties could blank. And so we know that we're most likely dealing with inductive reasoning. So we know that ultimately we're saying that because these people understand persuasive communication well, despite constituting a modest fraction, they're able to assert a lot of influence, or in this case, sway public sentiment during speeches, allowing us to pick B as the answer. Now let's look at why the other ones wouldn't make sense. If we read A, it says, encourage the crowd to develop their rhetorical skills to match the orators. There's no evidence of the crowd wanting to develop their rhetorical skills. And so this is introducing new information, allowing us to eliminate A as the answer. Now what about C? Prompt the uninitiated in the crowd to disregard the speech entirely. Why would they disregard the speech? There's no evidence of that, allowing us to eliminate C. Increase the demand for public speeches that employ sophisticated rhetorical techniques. Is there a demand for public speeches that use sophisticated rhetorical techniques? Not necessarily, and so we can eliminate D as a result of using new information again, leaving us with B as the answer. Now moving on to number 15. So now we're on to the grammar section, the grammar part of the reading module. And so with grammar, we have two kinds of grammar questions. One, boundaries, which deals with punctuation. And then we have form, structure, and tense, which deals with things like misplaced modifiers, tense, etc. And so we can see that we're dealing with a boundaries question or punctuation question here. And so when we try to determine what would be the answer here, it's important that we see that there's a comma after the O here in callow, meaning that known for her self-portraits and exploration of identity is acting as an appositive phrase. And so if we have an appositive here, we want to surround an appositive in commas, allowing us to pick A as the answer here. B, C, and D would be all grammatically incorrect and have different use cases that wouldn't work in this particular question. Now moving on to 16, here we have a form question. So it reads, according to astronomers, the Milky Way is a barred spiral galaxy and blank contains over 100 billion stars. So here we want to know, what are we referring to in this blank? What noun are we referring to? And we know that we're referring to the Milky Way, right? So the Milky Way contains over 100 billion stars, and we know that the Milky Way is singular, making us want to pick B as the answer. Itself would be awkward in this sort of context, and they would be referring to plural, and one would be something that we talk about when we talk about a person in a neutral sense. And so that's why we can eliminate D, and we're left with B as our answer here. Moving on to number 17. So this is a quick rule that you always have to remember with this kind of question. Whenever we have some sort of profession and then the name of the person, there's never a comma in between the profession and the name. However, here we do see that there is a second dash in this sentence. And so if there's a dash, we know that in the middle of a sentence, when we have additional information, which is in the form here, famous for his dystopian novels, 1984 and On the Animal Farm, we know that we need two dashes, both before and after the additional information, allowing us to pick B as the answer. and the other ones would be therefore grammatically incorrect. Okay, now moving on to number 18. Here we have a form question where we want to refer to the subject in question. And so our first question should be, what is the subject that we're talking about? And so if we just basically eliminate this additional information, which can live for more than 2,000 years, it becomes clear what is the subject of the sentence. And the subject would be trees. And so trees requires a plural verb. And so when we look at the various answers, we want to pick the least complicated. And we know that we're talking about the present tense. And so therefore, we would pick be as opposed to a singular noun, or in this case, the present perfect wouldn't make sense in this context as much as just using a present verb. And so therefore, we would pick be as our answer. Now moving on to number 19. So let's first read the sentence in question. It says, through her research, Goodall discovered that chimpanzees exhibit complex social behaviors, use tools, and blank, thereby challenging the conventional understanding. We see that this part is a dependent clause, and so there must be a comma before thereby. And so if that's the case, there would be only one answer that could potentially make sense here, and that would be to use a comma. B doesn't make sense because the last part is a dependent clause and not an independent clause, making B wrong. A would be using something without commas, even though you need to use commas, eliminating A. And then finally D, we don't have some sort of list, or we're not saying, like, for example, they use one thing and then talking about that one thing. And so as a result, we can eliminate D as its improper use of, in this case, a colon. And so we're left with C as our answer here. Okay, so here again, we want to find what we're looking for as the subject in the sentence. And so when we look at the sentence itself, we see that they're talking about bacteria. And so the singular of bacteria is bacterium, and bacteria are plural. And so if that's the case, we know that it says they also convert nitrogen. So that's another hint that we're talking about a plural subject. And so if that's the case, we need a plural noun here before growth. And so therefore we would say their growth, or A. Your, its, they would not make sense in context, allowing us to solidify A as the answer. Now moving on to 21. So when we read the sentence in question, it's defying all odds. Hamilton didn't just return to the water. She blank the 2004 NSSA National Championships in California. She won first place in the Explorer Women's Division and secured a position as a top-ranked female surfer. So, first of all, when we read the first part of the sentence, defying all odds, Hamilton didn't just return to the water. She blew her competition out of the water figuratively. We know that that alone can act as a sentence. And then after, during the 2004 NSA National Championships in California, she won first place. So we have two sentences that need to be separated with either a period or a dash. And a period or a semicolon. And the only answer that would do that would be D. The other answers would essentially create a comma splice with C. And then B, blew her competition out of the water figuratively during the 2004 NSA National Championships. That's just a run-on sentence, which wouldn't make sense. And so we can eliminate B and C. And then finally A, blew her competition out of the water figuratively during, again, same problem. We're just continuing a sentence that needs to stop. And so we're left with D as our answer here. Now moving on to 22. Now that we're done with the grammar part of the module, now we're moving on to expression of ideas questions. So the first kind of expression of idea question that we're talking about would be transition questions. And so we want to look at the relationship among sentences. And so what we can do is first see in the second sentence, it says, his famous equation E equals mc squared revealed the equivalence of mass and energy. And so the question is, Einstein's work laid the foundation for various modern technologies. What is the relationship between the previous sentence and this last sentence? And so nonetheless, are we discussing some sort of contrast or but? No, so we can eliminate A. Are we talking about a summary of things that have been said before? No, it's new information, so we can eliminate B. Despite this, or saying something contrary to what we would expect, that wouldn't make sense, so we can eliminate despite this, and so we're left with accordingly. So guys, you need to remember that accordingly doesn't mean, in this case, according to. It means consequently or therefore. And so we know that we're talking about a cause and effect relationship by revealing the equivalence of mass and energy. He laid the foundation for these various modern technologies. And so because we're talking about a cause and effect relationship, we can pick C as our answer. Now moving on to 23. So in 23, we see that the second sentence reads, it maintained order. The Roman Empire maintained order and stability through a complex system of government and law. So it maintained order, but then all of a sudden in the last sentence, we see that there's eventually succumbing to a combination of internal strife. So we want some sort of contrasting transition here. And so therefore wouldn't make sense. Furthermore, or additionally, wouldn't contrast the two sentences, and so we can eliminate C. In contrast is when we basically compare A and B, but we're not comparing A and B. We're basically saying, however, this didn't occur forever. So we're talking about more in terms of some sort of chronological time order in which something happened contrary to what happened before. And we don't use in contrast in that sort of situation. So we're left with B or but, nevertheless, as our answer here. Now moving on to 24. So we have the jazz age here, right? That's a period during the 1920s. And we had these musicians gaining widespread acclaim. But then at the same time, these writers also challenged racial inequality. And so because we're talking about at the same time, we know that simultaneously but must be the answer. But the question is, why do the other ones not make sense? So conversely and on the contrary, I mean pretty similar things. But the thing is, challenging racial inequality and garnering widespread acclaim through this music are not opposed things, right? They're not complete opposites. And so if that's the case, because we're not talking about direct opposites and comparing those two opposites, conversely and on the contrary don't make sense. And we're not talking about some sort of conclusion to what was mentioned before, so we can eliminate C as our answer, leaving us with B. Okay, so now with 25, we have another transition question. I think this is around the final one. We have the fact that social media has had an impact on mental health and privacy, and this has raised concerns, right? And so one of the impacts that's actually discussed here is the fact that it can lead to increased anxiety. So they're giving an example of the impact. So because they're giving an example of the impact, for instance, would be a right answer. On the other hand, again, is when we compare A and B, and so that's not what we're doing, and so we can eliminate B. In addition, is talking about new information, which is not necessarily what we're talking about, and instead would basically be talking about some sort of expectation contrary to what we would expect. And so as a result, D would not make sense, and we're left with A as our answer here. Okay, so finally we have rhetorical synthesis questions, which is always the last kind of question that appears in the module. And so with this first rhetorical synthesis question, we want to, as opposed to starting with the bullets first, also always read the objective of the student first. And so it says the student wants to emphasize the geographical extent of the Roman Empire. Okay, and so what we want to do is first read through A, B, and C, and D. And if there's only one answer choice that answers this objective of the student, then we don't even have to read the bullets. If there are multiple answers that addresses this objective of the student, that's when we have to read the bullets. So let's look through A, B, C, and D, and which ones talk about the geographical extent of the Roman Empire. And so when we look at A, first of all, it says the Roman Empire's political system consisted of a mix of monarchy, oligarchy, and democracy, contributing to its vast influence across Europe and beyond. Do they talk about the geographical extent of the Roman Empire? No, they focus on the political system, and so we can eliminate A. Let's look at D. The decline of the Roman Empire was due to various factors, despite its impressive geographical extent covering multiple continents. Okay, so they do talk about the fact that it covered multiple continents, but they're not detailed, and they focus on the decline, so we can eliminate D here. What about C? During the Pax Romana, the Roman Empire experienced a period of peace and stability that extended across its various vast territories. And so we know that it doesn't specify the vast territories specifically in terms of countries or continents, and so we can eliminate C. We're left with B, which reads, the Roman Empire, one of history's most powerful civilizations, spanned much of Europe, North Africa, and the Middle East as its peak. So it talks about specifically geographical extent of the Roman Empire or size of the Roman Empire, and so as a result, we can pick B as our answer here. So finally, concluding the module with number 27. So the student wants to explain the role of the protagonist in 1984. And so we want to know what the protagonist's role is in the book. And so let's look at the answer choices first. So 1984 is a dystopian novel by George Orwell that explores the impact of surveillance, propaganda, and the power of language on society and individual freedom. Is there any mention of the protagonist here? No. So we can eliminate A. Okay, and let's look at B. Winston Smith works at the Ministry of Truth in Oceania, where he alters historical records to fit the party's narrative, reflecting the themes of propaganda and control in 1984. This directly explains what his role is in terms of altering the historical records to fit the party's narrative, and so B would be a good answer. Let's make sure that C and D don't work. C, George Orwell's 1984 is set in the totalitarian state of Oceania, where Winston Smith struggles against oppression. Just simply saying he struggles against oppression is not talking about exactly what his role is, so we can eliminate C as our answer. We're left with D. As a warning against the dangers of totalitarianism, 1984 by George Orwell examines the erosion of individual freedom in a society characterized by surveillance and manipulation. Is there any mention of Winston Smith or the protagonist? No, and so we can eliminate D, and we're left with B as our answer. This concludes Module 1, and we're now going to move on to the lower module of Test 1. Thank you. Okay, so now moving on to the lower module here. Our first question is, of course, a word and context question. And what we have in the answer choices that we can see is past tense verbs. And so if we have past tense verbs, what we want to do is first look at what is the subject of the sentence in question. And we can see that they're talking about he, and the object is these sequences of human figures. And because we know that he's a photographer, what is he doing with these sequences of human figures? He's taking a picture of them. And so another way of saying take a picture of is capture. And so that's why we pick D here. In terms of why would the other answers not work, alleviated or make better wouldn't make sense in context, and so we can eliminate A. Ignored would be the opposite of what we're looking for. And fabricate or make up wouldn't make sense either. And so we're left with D as our answer here. Now moving on to number 2. Number 2, we're dealing with nouns. And so what we want to do is first look at the sentence in question. And so her work led to a nationwide environmental movement and was instrumental in the blank of the Environmental Protection Agency. So we know that because she had this environmental agenda, she must have had an influence in either the operation of or the initiation of the Environmental Protection Agency. And so when we look at the answers, in this case, suppression, which means stop, wouldn't make sense. And then disruption, or essentially interference, wouldn't make sense. And so we can eliminate B. So A and B don't make sense. And then D, hindrance or something that's bothersome wouldn't make sense either. Bother. And so we can eliminate D, and we're left with inception or initiation or creation of being our answer here. Okay, so now moving on to number 3. So with number 3 here, we have adjectives. And so just so you guys know here, if we have a word like repudiated, right? This RE generally tends to mean one of two things. So the most common usage we see is a rejection. And so RE can mean a rejection of something. Or it can mean repetition, right? To do something again. And so let me just give you some examples of words that work with this. So rejection, we can have, for example, revoke, rebuke. So revoke means to take something back. Rebuke means to criticize or scold. And so we see RE sort of having this negative connotation commonly. And then also it can have repetition, right? To do something again. And so when we look back at the text, we see that this person, Andrew Wiles, published this proof and is responsible for a significant achievement in the field of mathematics. So if that's true, he must be famous to an extent. And so when we look at the answers, repudiate or reject would not make sense. Renowned or famous would be the best answer here. In terms of what do the other words mean here? Resuscitate or bring back to life. That wouldn't work. And ratify or officially approve. Also wouldn't make sense. And so we're left with renowned as our answer here. Now moving on to number 4. So here we have verbs, and let's look at specifically what's happening. We have the works of painter Henri Matisse. And so because he had this audacious departure from realistic representation, we can infer that, one, because of the skepticism, he was criticized, right? And so we want something that essentially means criticized. And so when we look at the answers here, financed or given money would not work, right? So we can eliminate D. Protected would be the opposite of what we're looking for. Endorsed or supported would be, again, the opposite of what we're looking for. Scrutinized or followed closely. Scrutinized also, connotation-wise, tends to mean criticized often. And so that would be the best answer here, scrutinized. Okay, so now moving on to number 5. So with 5, we're looking at the Montessori method of education, and we can see that in the answer choices, we're looking at nouns, right? And so let's look at the sentence in question. And it says, however, Montessori's approach initially faced strong blank from conventional educators who believed in teacher-led instruction. And so we know that Montessori education is this child-led learning, right? And so conventional educators who believed in teacher-led instruction are going to disagree or potentially criticize the Montessori approach. And so we want something that means something along those lines. And so assimilation or trying to adjust to some sort of new culture or surrounding would not make sense. Compliance or following the rules would not make sense. Now looking at dissent versus predilection. Predilection is like basically a tendency to do something, and so that wouldn't make sense. Or a liking to do something, right? That wouldn't make sense, and so we're left with dissent or going against something. And so dissent would be our best answer here. Now moving on to number 6. With 6, what we have is the other kind of vocab and context question where we have an underlined word. And so with this question, we want to do things a little bit differently than what we did before, as opposed to simply picking an answer that would occur, that would work most naturally in the blank. What we want to do is now pick a replacement for the word that is underlined. And so we can see that the word here, accompanied, is underlined. And so what we want to do is replace accompanied with every single answer choice and find what works most naturally. And so we can see that they're talking about this woman, right? So her image accompanied me and even in places the most hostile to romance. So her image encouraged me even in places the most hostile to romance. If this place is somewhere hostile to romance, her image wouldn't encourage someone, right? Her image entertained me even in places the most hostile to romance. That would be also awkward use of what's happening here. Her image guided me. There's no evidence that the image is guiding him. It's rather that the image is following him wherever he goes. And so that's why we can pick here D as our answer. Now moving on to number 7. With 7, we can see that we're dealing with what's called verb phrases. And so let's look at the sentence in question. The sentence in question reads, a result of the political upheaval, many private collections and royal repositories became blank their invaluable pieces. So we know that in the first sentence it says that these artworks were seized or destroyed, right? And so if these artworks were seized or destroyed, no longer do these private collections and repositories have those artworks, right? And so we want to basically pick something that means don't have anymore, devoid of, lack of, right? And so tampered with their invaluable pieces, you can't become tampered with. So just as a result of that being awkward and not making sense here, A wouldn't make sense. So in terms of what is the actual definition of tamper with, it means to interfere with, right? And then in terms of B, oblivious to. So the repository became oblivious to their invaluable species. They're highly aware of them. They're not oblivious, right? So B would make sense. In terms of D versus C, averse to means not liking something. That doesn't make sense here in context either. And so bereft of or lacking, devoid of, would be our best answer. And so we can pick C as our answer here. Okay, so now that we're done with the vocab and context questions, we're now moving on to what we have here is an according to the text question, which falls under the central ideas and details category. So in terms of how we do this question, what we want to do is look for the specific wording that occurs in the question. And we see that it says, according to the text, why was the detection of neutrinos from the CNO cycle by the Borg-Zeno experiment significant? And so when do they actually talk about the detection? We see that the detection occurs in the last sentence. And so it says, this detection has confirmed that the CNO cycle, though less dominant than the proton-proton chain, indeed contributes to the sun's energy production. And so we have two things that contribute towards the sun's energy production. We have the CNO cycle and we have the proton-proton chain. And so both of these elements contribute towards the sun's energy production. And so if that's the case, if we look at A says it proves that the sun's energy production is solely based on the CNO cycle. And that's not what we just said, right? We said that the CNO cycle and the proton-proton chain have an influence on the sun's energy production, so we can eliminate A. In terms of the other options, if we look at D first, it implies that the sun's energy production does not involve the conversion of hydrogen into helium. The conversion of hydrogen into helium, if we look at the passage, it has to do with the process of the proton-proton change. And we know that the proton-proton change does play an impact in energy production, and so D would not be able to make sense. We look at C versus B. C reads, it suggests that the proton-proton chain does not contribute significantly to the sun's energy. That contradicts the information in the passage, given the fact that we said it does indeed have an impact, and so C wouldn't make sense. If we look at B, it supports the occurrence of the CNO cycle in the sun's energy production alongside the more dominant proton-proton chain. Okay, that exactly agrees with what's in the last sentence, and so as a result, we can pick B as our answer here. Now, moving on to number 9. So if we look at number 9 is a quotation claim question. And so let's read what the quotation claim actually is. It's that the poem conveys the speaker's longing to be unchanging and eternal, much like the bright star, to forever appreciate the beauty of his beloved. And so when we look for an answer here, we need to make sure that it addresses unchanging and eternal and the beauty of his beloved. Forever appreciating, right? And so when we look at the answers here, essentially what A is doing is it's not saying the bright star is eternal. It's saying that the bright star is essentially alone, unlike his beloved. And so this is irrelevant to what we want to basically say. And so that's why we would eliminate A as an answer. In terms of B, we have the moving waters at their priest-like task of pure ablution around Earth's human shores, or gazing on a new soft fallen mask of snow upon the mountains and the moors. This is essentially just talking about nature. It's not comparing this longing to be unchanging and eternal to a bright star, and so as a result of it being irrelevant, we can eliminate B. C versus D, if we look at D first, it says, still to hear her tender taken breath, and so live ever, or else swoon to death. There's no mention of the unchanging aspect in D, and so we can eliminate D. We're left with C, which essentially says, no, yet still steadfast, still unchangeable. Pillowed upon my fair love's ripening breast, to feel forever its soft fallen swell, awake forever in a sweet unrest. So it's not only addressing the unchanging and eternal component, it's talking about appreciating his beloved forever. And so as a result, we can pick C as our answer here. Now looking at number 10, we have another quotation claim question. And so what is the quotation, the claim that's being talked about in the paragraph? We see that it says, he credits the citizens financial assistance in a memorable remark for his transformation, and he wishes to return a fortune to this unknown benefactor. So there's some sort of citizens donation or financial assistance he made, and he wants to pay back that benefactor, that donator, right? So when we look at A, does that have anything to do with wanting to donate back or return his fortune to the benefactor? And there is no mention of that whatsoever in A, and so we can eliminate A. B, for the same reason, is wrong, right? It's talking about him being a gambler and asking for help. It doesn't have to do with wanting to pay back or give back the fortune to the unknown benefactor, and so we can eliminate B. In terms of C versus D, C is focused on the town and the environment in the town rather than returning the fortune, and so C would not make sense. And so D, now I have no idea who that man was, but I want him found so that what? He can have the money or give it away, testifying my gratitude to him. So this directly addresses what was mentioned in the claim, and so as a result, we can pick D here as our answer. So one more claim question. What we have here is it says, Jeremy shows skepticism towards this decision. What is the decision that they're talking about? The Valentine deciding to turn towards philosophy and writing to spite those who've scorned him, right? So Jeremy should not like this idea of him turning to writing. And so in terms of the answer choices, if we look at A, C, and D, there's no mention of writing nor philosophy in any of these answer choices. So we can eliminate A, C, and D altogether. And we're left with B, which says, you don't mean to write, right? That's a sort of air of skepticism in the way in which the questions ask. Sir, it's impossible. I may die with you, starve with you, or be damned with your works. But to live even 3 days the life of a play. So essentially he's talking about the fact that this decision to write is not a good idea, right? You shouldn't do that. It's impossible. And so that's why, in this case, B would be the best answer here. Now moving on to number 12, which is a logic question. What we want to see is, first of all, are we dealing with inductive reasoning versus deductive reasoning, right? Do we have the facts and then are we creating a conclusion, or do we have a conclusion then facts? And so we can see that we have that would imply that here. And so if we have that would imply that, essentially we know that we're dealing with some sort of conclusion. And so what's going on here? We see that this peppered moth developed a diurnal flying gene variant. And so diurnal is essentially flying during the day. And then it says the peppered moth was usually depicted as a nocturnal creature. And so what can we infer from this? We can infer that as a result of adaptation, some moths among the peppered species adjusted to flying during the day as opposed to at night. And so if that's the case, we want to pick an answer that means something similar. And so when we look at D, it says, some peppered moths might have adopted a diurnal lifestyle due to the genetic change, but the majority remains nocturnal until the 20th century. And so that would support what was said in the text without adding any sort of contradictory or new information. Let's look at the other choices. The genetic change in the peppered moth was an isolated occurrence and not influence the species' overall behavior. There's no mention of it being an isolated occurrence, and so we can eliminate A. B, the peppered moth was simultaneously nocturnal and diurnal during the Industrial Revolution. That doesn't make sense because then it wouldn't sleep, right? And so clearly, the species does have to sleep, and so there's no mention of this information either, and so we can eliminate B. C, the study published in Nature misidentified the gene variant associated with diurnal flying. So anything that has to do with, like, for example, an error in the question, in one of the answer choices, that's normally not going to be a right answer because there's no corroboration for this, right? There's no mention of any sort of error that was made in the study, and so that's why we can eliminate C, and we're left with D as a result here. Now looking at 13. So 13, we're dealing with something called infantile amnesia. And so infantile amnesia, it says, is not that adults can't tend to recall memories before the age of 3. And so when they look at this study, there was criticism that the researchers failed to take into account the influence of language development on memory recall. And so adults were required to verbalize their memories in the study, but language acquisition doesn't fully mature until the age of 2. And so when we think about this, right, so the study is looking at essentially the fact that 3 onwards, we tend to recall memories, right? But then at 2 years old, that's when we are able to actually start language. And so we have 2 sorts of memories, right? We have what are called verbal memories and nonverbal memories. And so if that's the case, what this may mean is essentially that from 3 years old, we theoretically begin to recall memories, but before 3, we don't, and especially before 2 specifically, we only have nonverbal memories, right? So if adults have to recall memories, there's a great chance that they only are recalling these verbal memories and they're not necessarily recalling these nonverbal memories. And so if that's the case, what can we actually think? Potentially, this infantile amnesia might actually start before 3 at an earlier age, but we just can't discern those memories earlier than 2, given the fact that they are nonverbal memories. And so as a result, that's why we could pick here C as our answer. May overestimate the onset age of infantile amnesia due to the reliance on language-based memory recall. And so when we look at the other answers here, first A, provide clear evidence for the phenomenon of infantile amnesia. It's doing the opposite, right? It's saying that infantile amnesia might not be the way that we think about it, and so A would make sense. Demonstrate the limitations of language as a tool for recalling earlier childhood memories. That's not what we're focused on here, right? We're focused on the fact that infantile amnesia might start from an age earlier than we expected. And then D, are limited in their applicability because they only examine adults' memories and not children's. So that's not necessarily relevant here because even if we examine the children's memories, we might come up with a similar result. We don't know necessarily whether there would be a different result. It's not mentioned in the passage, no comparison between adults and children, and so that's why we can eliminate D. And we're left with C as our answer. Okay, and so now 14, what 14 is basically talking about, again, we have inductive reasoning question. We see that they're talking about how predictive models, to be strong or robust, they should account for potential outliers. And so incorporating data from extreme cases or outliers might essentially strengthen the model. And so we want something positive, right? And so there's no mention of statistical textbooks, and so that's why we can eliminate A here. B, prevent data scientists from developing predictive models without considering outlier data. There's no mention of prevention here, so we can eliminate B. Simplify the modeling process for novice data scientists unfamiliar with machine learning algorithms. They never talk about novice data scientists here, so we can eliminate C. And so we know that D would be the answer because it would indeed enhance the model's capacity to generalize and make accurate predictions in diverse scenarios. And so we can pick D as our answer here. Okay, so now we have a direct support hypothesis question. And so we look at what is actually happening here. We see that they're saying that color changing capability could also play a key role in octopus's communication with each other. So the answer should have something to do with the color changing ability. And so if we look at C, first of all, there's no mention of color changing ability, and so we can eliminate it. We look at the other options. D, all octopuses exhibited the same level of interaction with each other regardless of their color changing abilities. This would essentially weaken the hypothesis rather than support it, and so we can eliminate D. Looking at A versus B, B says octopuses with color alteration ability demonstrated a tendency towards solitude rather than social interaction. This would again be the opposite because we would expect color changing ability to be something that's used in communication, so they should actually interact more rather than less. And so A, octopuses that were incapable of color transformation appeared to engage in more acts of aggression with their counterparts. Why does this make sense? Because coloration essentially acts as a form of communication, which can alleviate the chance for conflict. And so that's why we'll be able to pick A here. That's our answer. Okay, so now moving on to the grammar section of the lower module. What we have for this question is a pronoun question, right? Where we have them, it, which, or her. And so when we look at the first sentence, it says the term Goldilocks zone refers to the habitable zone around the star to blank Earth owes its ability to support life. So when we see the fact that we're dealing with a dependent clause and a noun being the last part of the independent clause in star, we know that we're dealing with a situation in which we can't use a pronoun and we can't use an object pronoun. So we can eliminate them being an object pronoun, it and her, well, one being possessive and one being a pronoun. And so that leaves us with which as our answer, given the fact that we are explaining this noun. And the reason why we have to here is the fact that the Earth owes its abilities to support life to the star, right? And so that's why we would pick C here as our answer. Now moving on to 17. So here we have another forum question where we want to look at they then engage in a frenzied breeding season with males blank fiercely for mates in both sexes, taking advantage of the abundance of food and water to reproduce and thrive. So if we have a normal sentence and then we have with attached in a dependent clause, we know that we're looking for the ing version of the verb. And so when we look at the answer choices, competing would be the best answer. And the other ones would not make sense. If we look at D, having competed, if this with wasn't here and we say they then engage in a frenzied breeding season, having competed, and then we have a with here and then some sort of other clause, D could potentially make sense, but that's not that scenario we have, given the fact that we start with here, and so D wouldn't make sense. And 2 would not make sense with 2, and then compete obviously wouldn't make sense either, leaving us with competing as our answer. Now moving on to this next question. So whenever we have a list, but within that list we have commas. Let's say, for example, I want to list city names, and I say, I want to live in Tokyo, Japan, Seoul, South Korea, and Paris, France. Well, in that case, after the city names, there's a comma. So in order for things to not be confusing, when we have a list and we have elements, then what we do is we have the commas, and then the outer part of this list, we use semicolons instead of commas to not make things confusing. And so if that's the case, if you look here, we have vitamin C rich oranges, semicolon, small antioxidant laden blueberries, and we need another semicolon. And so when we look at the answers here, the only one that would make sense would be C. The other answers, A, B, and D, do not contain semicolons, so we can eliminate them as potential answers. Now moving on to this next question, we have a form question where we want to find what subject we are referring to with this pronoun. And so we see that the sentence in question says, it's important to note that while promising, the research on probiotics is still evolving and blank effects. So what is the verb? What is the noun that we're referring to? Are we talking about the research effects, or are we talking about probiotics' effects? And so we know that we're talking about the effects of probiotics, because probiotics is the continuing main subject of this piece. And so if that's true, probiotics is plural, not singular, and the only plural noun that would work here would therefore be there. And so we can pick it as our answer here. Okay, now moving on to the next question. We want to then identify what is the subject of the sentence that we're looking at. And so we see that if we remove this designed to remove dust, allergens, and harmful particles part, given the fact that that's additional information, we're left with the innovative system should filter out harmful particles. And we know that the innovative system must be the subject here, but we have the word should. And so should filter and should establish. And so A would be our answer. If we didn't have the word should, then we could pick B as the answer, establishes. We're not talking about past tense, and so we can eliminate C. And establishing wouldn't make sense because it's an ing version of the verb. And so that wouldn't work in context here with should. Now moving on to the next question. So researchers now wonder where, and we have multiple answers here that could potentially work. Are we actually asking a question? If researchers are just wondering something, we're not asking a question, so we can immediately eliminate A and D. And so are we looking for, the researchers now wonder where did the passages lead? Researchers now wonder where the passages led. So in terms of the correct grammatical construction here, we would say researchers now wonder where the passages led. Researchers now wonder where did the passages lead would be a incorrect grammatical structure, and so we can eliminate C as the answer, leaving us with B. Now moving on to number 22. So when we talk about the two scientific fields that are mentioned here, we don't have language that's different. For example, we don't say in different scientific fields, we say in two different scientific fields. And so we're just listing out the two different scientific fields that we're talking about. And so whenever we're listing anything out, we need to use a colon, and so A would be the answer. B using a semicolon would not make sense because we're not dealing with two independent clauses, and so we can eliminate B. D would be a run-on sentence, and so we can eliminate D. C, fields, comma, such as physics and chemistry. The reason why this would be wrong is they're only talking about these two different scientific fields. Such as implies examples, but because such as physics and chemistry is already two, those aren't examples, right? They're just the two things that are being listed, and so C would not make sense. We can only use such as in example situations. Now moving on to number 23. Here, the question is, are we looking at past or present tense. And so it says, over the years, dedicated archaeologists such as Fiorelli, who introduced the method to cast the bodies of Vesuvius's victims. So over the years, meaning in the past and present today. And so if that's the case, we need something that is essentially present perfect, that accounts for the past and present. And so that's why have and covered would be the best answer. And we know that we're talking about archaeologists, and so we're talking about a plural verb rather than a singular verb, leaving us with C as the answer. Over the years implies today is still true, and so uncovered or in the past also would not make sense, leaving us with C as the answer. Okay, so now that we're done with the grammar questions, now let's move on to the transition questions. And so let's start by trying to establish the relationship among sentences in this piece. And so it says here, the groundbreaking discovery of the Higgs boson in 2012 at the Large Hadron Collider provided crucial evidence for the Higgs field, a fundamental component of the standard model of particle physics. This landmark discovery confirmed our understanding of how particles gain mass. So we had this discovery of the Higgs boson in 2012, which confirmed our understanding of how particles gained mass. Now, there was also this gravitational waves discovery in 2016. And so both had some sort of contribution that changed the way that we think of things. Or not changed the way that we think of things, confirmed the way that we think of things. So we see that confirmed our understanding of how particles gain mass and confirming a century-old prediction. So if that's the case, because these are two confirmations, the best way that we can link them is something along the lines of similarly or in the same vein. Concurrently implies that something is occurring at the same time as something else. Concurrently means simultaneously. And so simultaneously would not be right. On the other hand, implies some sort of contrast, which is not occurring here. And furthermore, would theoretically work if in the same vein was not an option, but we're talking about more of some sort of similar pattern rather than an additional example or information. And so B would be a better answer than D. Now moving on to 25. So what we have here is a situation in which we have this discovery of Homo floresiensis, right? And it provided fascinating insights into human evolution. And then so they talk about this discovery of this specific species, but then they talk about another species, and the Denisovans, right? And so there are two species. And how do we link these two sentences? By essentially saying, here's one species, but in addition, here's another species. And so moreover, or furthermore, additionally would be the best answer. Conversely would imply that we're talking about some sort of opposing relationship, which doesn't make sense. Instead would imply that we are taking some sort of route or doing something instead of something else, and so that wouldn't make sense. In spite of this or despite would not make sense either, allowing us to pick a moreover as our answer here. So now we are finally on to the last kind of question, the rhetorical synthesis questions. And so we want to first look at what the student's objective is, and we can see that the student's objective is the student wants to portray the range of Benjamin Franklin's contributions. And so how did he make these diverse contributions? What kind of diverse contributions did he make? So when we look at A, first of all, do we actually talk about the range of contributions? No. And so we can eliminate A. B, so he was not only a significant player in politics, but also contributed to society through his writing and civic activism. So that would be potentially an answer because of the fact that it talks about multiple things. So let's leave that as potentially an answer. Let's look at C. Known for his polymathic nature, Benjamin Franklin's influence spanned across fields such as science, literature, and social activism. So in comparing B and C, we can see that C is much more specific in terms of the range of things he did, not only just talking about two of those things, and so we can eliminate B. Looking at D, D is no mention of any sort of range of activities that he was a part of, and so more so than D, we have C as our answer here. And now finally concluding with number 27. So it says the student wants to convey the circumstances and the mystery surrounding the Dyatlov Pass incident. And so we know that we're not only looking for one circumstance, but circumstances in the mystery, right? So when we look at A doesn't talk about what the actual circumstances were, and so we can eliminate A. C, again, just says that they had a mysterious death rather than talking about what the actual circumstances were that were peculiar, and so C would be a wrong answer. D, incident found that the hikers tore their tent from the inside. That is indeed peculiar, but it's only one circumstance rather than circumstances, and we can eliminate D. And so we're left with B. The past incidents is puzzling because the hikers found dead had inexplicable injuries and then fled their tent without proper clothing or shoes. This is multiple circumstances that are mysterious and peculiar, and so as a result, we can pick B as our answer. That concludes the lower module. Okay, so now we're going to move on to the upper module. And so the first question, like always we have here, is a word and context question. And we can see that here we're dealing with a blank and word and context question. And so let's go ahead and try to solve it. And so we can see that the options here are all verbs. And so what we want to do is identify the subject and object of the sentence in question. And so we can see that the subject of the sentence in question would be people struggled to blank their way. And so our object would be their way. And so people struggled to circumvent their way through the limited visibility. People struggled to conjure their way through the limited visibility. People struggled to discern their way through the limited visibility, and people struggled to meander their way through the limited visibility. So this is a little bit tricky because we have multiple words here that upon first glance might seem to work. And so circumventing or going around something, if it was circumventing the limited visibility, then that might make sense here. Or circumventing some sort of obstacle, rather, that would make sense, but that's not the situation we're dealing with. It's circumventing their way, which is not a expression that's actually used. And so circumvent or go around wouldn't make sense in context, so we can eliminate A here. In terms of conjure or try to imagine something, imagine their way through the limited visibility seems very, very awkward, and so we can eliminate B. Now we're in between C and D. And in terms of what meander basically means like to follow a winding course like this. And so there's no evidence that this course was winding per se, and so we can eliminate D and we're left with discern, or sort of judge their way through the limited visibility, and so discern would make the most sense here, and we can pick C as our answer. Now moving on to number 2. So again, another word and context question. This module is going to have a lot of word and context questions given the fact that our first module only had, I believe, 2. And so looking at this next question, we see that they are talking about adjectives here. And so they're talking about the fact that this automotive industry, in Detroit per se, has fallen into a state of decay. And so decay is a critical word for here. And also we see that it says this state of disrepair. And so again, anytime that we are talking about adjectives in our answers, we want to look for tone words within the passage. And so let's now look at our answer choices, and we see first nascent or from birth. That wouldn't work as an option here and contains a different meaning. Immutable or unchangeable. Clearly things did change, and so B wouldn't make sense either. And now we're left with auspicious or desolate, and auspicious basically means favorable. And so that wouldn't work here, or fortunate. And so we can eliminate auspicious, and we're left with this negative word desolate, which means basically sort of empty and dreary, which would give us the definition that we need here, and we would pick C as a result. Now moving on to number 3. Here we have verbs in our answers, and so we know that we should identify the subject and verb of the sentence. We see that the subject of the verb, the sentence in question would be Munez, and the object would be the idea that beauty is subjective and multifaceted. And so let's see first what he is saying about his idea of beauty. And so we know that he challenges conventional notions of beauty. And so he's sort of subjective in his approach to beauty. And so as a result, we want to pick something that basically says Munez supports the idea that beauty is subjective. In terms of what each of these words means, repels or sort of, which would be the opposite of attract, wouldn't make sense, so we can eliminate A. Censures or punishes or restricts wouldn't make sense. Again, it's a negative word, so we can eliminate B. Ratify is approve, but sort of in an official sense, and so we can eliminate C as an answer. And we're left with D, champions or supports, as our answer, which would make sense in context here. Now moving on to number 4. Here we're looking at verbs, and so let's look at the subject and object of the sentence again. And so we see that here they're talking about her ability as the subject and compromise from seemingly intractable positions. And so because we know that she's a renowned diplomat and former United States ambassador, we know that she must have this skill and ability to create compromise from these intractable positions. And so extort wouldn't make sense. The extort is extremely negative and basically means to threaten, normally in a monetary sense, and so that wouldn't make sense here. Admonish or warn wouldn't make sense. Again, that's a negative word. Broach, which basically means to introduce, sort of something that's uncomfortable generally, wouldn't make sense here because there's no evidence that she's introducing compromise. She's essentially creating compromise, right? So elicit or give way to would make sense as our answer here, and we can pick D. Now moving on to number 5. So here we have another word and context question. And so what we want to identify here is the fact that we're looking at verbs. And so let's see what we're talking about. So this method of communication allows honeybees to blank the location of food. This method of communication allows honeybees to obfuscate the location of food sources to other members, misappropriate to other members, divulge to other members, or misconstrue to other members. So we know that honeybees want to work together, right? So they want to be able to communicate or let other bees know the location of the food. And so if that's true, something like obfuscate or to make ambiguous would not work. Misappropriate, or basically to distribute in a wrong way, would not make sense. And then we're between divulge and misconstrue is to misunderstand, and so we're left with divulge or communicate or give some sort of information to another. And so we would be left with C as our answer here. Now moving on to number 6. So here we have adjectives. So let's sort of look at the sentence in hand. And so it says that the discovery of the ancient city of Machu Picchu by explorer Hiram Bingham in 1911 captivated historians and archaeologists as it provided a blank insight into the lives of the Inca civilization. And so this question is a little bit tricky because it looks like 2 of these options could actually work. And so we have 2 potential options that are attractive. One would be evocative and one would be palpable. And so when we look at evocative versus palpable here, evocative basically means to stir feelings. And so the reason why this is wrong in this context is there's not any feelings inherent in the word using insight. Insight is talking about sort of like actual factual information that we're talking about. And so what we want to, rather than pick evocative here, palpable where basically means almost seemingly real, or something that we can almost touch, would be a more accurate take on what is actually happening in terms of the insights that were made from the ancient city. And so we can pick palpable as our answer. Cursory or brief wouldn't make sense here because there's no evidence that it was brief or short. And then fleeting or short-lived also would not make sense. And so we're left with D as our answer. Okay, now moving on to number 7. Here we have adjectives. And so we know that we have these two parties, the Republican Party and the Democratic Party. And they have their own ideals, and they sometimes argue over these ideals, right? And so each party's blank insistence on its own ideals. Each party's congenial insistence on its own ideals would basically be implying that each party has some sort of pleasurable insistence, because congenial generally means something along the lines of pleasure. And so that wouldn't make sense here. It would be awkward. If we look at dogmatic, pliable, and ambivalent, pliable or flexible, flexible insistence would be like an oxymoron, which wouldn't make sense here, and so we could eliminate C. Ambivalent or sort of mixed feelings wouldn't make sense because ambivalent insistence doesn't make sense either. And so we're left with dogmatic, or in this case, sort of arrogant insistence. And so dogmatic would make the most sense here. And we can pick B as our answer. Now moving on to number 8. So I believe this is the last word and context question for this section. What we need to do is basically look at the various ing verbs that are mentioned here, and we see that it says this fascinating technique involves dolphins blank their tails on the water's surface. And so, when we think about dolphins and what they do with their tails on the water's surface, they essentially flap their tails, right? And so languishing or dying wouldn't make sense here, so we can eliminate A. Suppressing or stopping their tails wouldn't make sense here, so we can eliminate B. So we're left with C and D. And dismantling or basically taking apart their tails wouldn't make sense either, and so we're left with thrashing, or essentially splashing violently their tails on the water surface. Not violently, but aggressively. That would make sense, and so we can pick C as our answer here. Now moving on to number 9. So according to the text, what is true about the Oblonskys? And so here what we're doing is we're looking at an according to the text central idea and details question. And so what we want to do is we want to read the text first and identify what part is actually true about the Oblonskys. And so what is actually happening in this passage? Well, they have the husband that was basically having an affair. And then, so what happened with the husband is that as a result of the affair, everybody was conscious of it, and the wife felt like she could not go on living with the husband anymore. And so when we look at the options here, what is true about the Oblonskys? A, the Oblonskys are a close-knit family with strong bonds despite internal struggles. Is there any evidence that they have strong bonds here? No, and so we can eliminate A. Looking at B, C, and D, if we look at D first, the Oblonskys encounter friction with the stray people due to the French governess. This has nothing to do with actually what's being said in the passage. The stray people are only mentioned in the very last sentence, and so we can eliminate D. And then when we look at C, the Oblonskys endure a sense of disconnection caused by the stray people. And when we look at the actual passage and what it says about the stray people, it says the stray people brought together by a chance in any inn had more in common with another than they, the members of the family and household of the Oblonskys. They're basically just comparing the stray people and the Oblonskys, not saying that the stray people caused a sense of disconnection as a result to the Oblonskys. And so that's why we can eliminate C, and we're left with B, therefore. The Oblonskys' household is in turmoil due to the husband's indiscretion or carrying on this affair with this French girl, and so that's why we can pick B as our answer here. Now moving on to number 10, so we have a directly support the research claim kind of question, and so what we want to do is first identify what is the claim of the passage, and the claim of the passage is the development of new antibiotics is critical to combat resistance, antibiotic resistance. So we know that our answer has to have something about the development of new antibiotics. And so when we look at the various answers here, B, first of all, has no mention of the development of new antibiotics. And A is saying that the discovery of penicillin was a serendipitous event, which has no relevance to basically saying that these new antibiotics combat antibiotic resistance, and so we can eliminate A. And then we're left with C versus D. And so when we look at C versus D, C reads, the development of new antibiotics with novel mechanisms of action can help target resistant bacteria, which is this combating antibiotic resistance, and help to preserve the effectiveness of existing biotics. So C is directly addressing and supporting the claim that we made before, so we can pick C as our answer. Why is D wrong? Antibiotic stewardship programs, which promote the appropriate use of antibiotics, are important for minimizing the emergence and spread of antibiotic resistance bacteria. This is not about the development of new antibiotics. And so we can eliminate D, leaving us with C as the answer. So now moving on to 11. So 11 is a quotation claim question. And so with quotation claim questions, what we want to first do is highlight what is the claim that's even being mentioned. And so when we look at the claim, it says, Kipling urges the reader, whom he addresses directly, to remain resilient even when seemingly losing all hope. Okay, and so when we look at the various options here, what does A actually mean? A is basically talking about us wanting to or needing to remain hopeful, but it has not any direct reference to resilience, and so we can eliminate A as our answer. B, if neither foes nor loving friends can hurt you, if all men count with you, but none too much, if you can fill the unforgiving minute. This has more to do with relationships and maintaining relationships, and the importance of relationships. And so as a result, we can eliminate B as the answer. If we look at C versus D, D, if you can talk with crowds and keep your virtue, or walk with kings, nor lose the common touch, yours is the earth and everything that's in it. This is about maintaining or preserving virtue, and that doesn't have to do with resilience also, and so we can eliminate D. Looking at C, if you can force your heart and nerve and sinew to serve your turn long after they are gone, and so hold on when there is nothing in you. So when losing all hope is this when there is nothing in you part, and talking about holding on and forcing your heart, these are the remaining resilient parts, and so we can pick C as our answer here. Now moving on to number 12. So 12, we have another support the claim question. And so let's first look at what the claim actually is. And so when we look at the passage, we see that it says, a historian asserts that Tubman's actions had a substantial impact on the success of the Underground Railroad. And so her actions had a substantial impact on the success of the railroad. And so when we look at the answers, it has to be about Tubman's actions and how they helped the Underground Railroad. And so when we look at B, first of all, B has nothing to do with the Underground Railroad. It does talk about her playing a key role in the suffrage movement and advocating for equal rights, but it's not about the Underground Railroad, and so we can eliminate B. Again, C doesn't have to do with the Underground Railroad. The same holds true for D. And so A talks about specifically what did she do in these underground railroads to help ensure the Underground Railroad's success. And so we can pick A as the answer then. Now moving on to 13. So here we have a main purpose of the text question. And so first what we want to do is try to understand what is being said in this text. And so the first thing that we really need to understand here is the fact that it says that that truth equals woman here. And so anytime they talk about woman, they're essentially talking about truth. And so when we read the first few lines, it says, supposing that truth is a woman, what then? Is there not ground for suspecting that all philosophers, insofar as they have been dogmatists, have failed to understand woman? And so philosophers have failed to understand truth is what that essentially means. And then throughout the passage, they continue to talk about this fact that the way in which these philosophers approach truth is misunderstood and essentially wrong. And so when we look at the answers here, to critique the seriousness and persistence with which philosophers approach truth. And so they do talk about the terrible seriousness and clumsy, but this is not a detail rather than the main purpose, and so we can eliminate A. Looking at C here, we see that they say to portray the current state of philosophical dogma as downtrodden and potentially obsolete. So again, they do mention that, but it's not the overall purpose of this text, and so we can eliminate C. To suggest that truth, like a woman, resists simplistic and heavy-handed attempts at understanding. Again, this is a detail, but it's not the purpose for this author writing this part of the work. And so throughout the passage itself, the main theme is to essentially assert that they've understood truth in an erroneous manner. And so that's why we would pick B as our answer here. Okay, so now moving on to number 14. Here we have a logically complete the text question. And so what we want to do is first identify whether this is an inductive reasoning or deductive reasoning sort of question. And so we can see by the wording here, thus, that we're talking about some sort of conclusion. Thus, we have a series of facts followed by a conclusion, making this inductive reasoning. And so if this is inductive reasoning, what we want to do is first look at the facts within the passage itself and form a conclusion based on those facts. And so they essentially argue that they want to anticipate future outcomes based on historical data, but in order to do that, robust models need to account for potential outliers. And so incorporating data in extreme cases when they deviate from the majority of observations is going to be something helpful rather than hurtful. And so when we look at the options, B would not make sense because it's negative. And then A, align the predictive models with the theoretical distributions postulated in statistical textbooks. In logic questions, we should never introduce new information in the answers, and statistical textbooks is essentially new information, which allows us to eliminate A as an answer. Looking at C versus D, C reads, simplify the modeling process for novice data scientists unfamiliar with machine learning algorithms. And so they never talk about novice data scientists and how they could be potentially unfamiliar with machine learning algorithms. And so we can eliminate C because of new information again. And we're left with D. Incorporating these outliers enhances the model's capacity to generalize and make accurate predictions. And so this agrees with what's being said in the passage, and we can pick it as an answer, therefore. Moving on to number 15, we have another logically complete the text question. And so what's going on here is we have this Greek philosopher, Epicurus. And so Epicurus is essentially saying that avoidance of pain He talks more about that than pleasure. And he's often associated with hedonism, right? But the conflict here is essentially that hedonism posits that the pursuit of pleasure is the highest good. So if that's the case, we essentially have this issue where Epicurus believes that avoidance of pain is most important, whereas hedonism, the doctrine that he's often associated with, talks about pursuit of pleasure being the most important. And so how can this simultaneously be true? And so what we need to do here is when we look at the answers, we cannot introduce new information, but we can reinterpret sort of the wording in terms of what was being said initially. And so when we look at D, first of all, the writings of Epicurus were misattributed. In reality, he didn't propagate hedonism at all. This directly contradicts what's said in the passage, so we can eliminate it immediately. C, hedonism was an esoteric philosophy, understood and interpreted differently among various Greek philosophers. This introduces new information. And so by introducing new information that's unsubstantiated, we can eliminate C as an answer. B, Epicurus was an anomaly among Greek philosophers, often contradicting the philosophical doctrines he himself endorsed. Saying that he contradicted the philosophical doctrines he endorsed was not mentioned in the passage. And so we can eliminate B. Looking at A, Epicurus held an atypical interpretation of hedonism in which the avoidance of pain was equated to the pursuit of pleasure. So this is a reinterpretation without actually introducing new information. Whereas if we equate avoidance of pain with pleasure in Epicurus's mind, he's simultaneously saying that avoidance of pain and pleasure are important, which would make sense in context and allow us to pick A as the answer here. Now moving on to number 16. So here we essentially have the mineral olivine, right? So we have olivine here. And then we have, in this case, a synthetic sort of counterpart that's supposed to do the same sort of thing. And then we have both 1,000 degrees Celsius and 13 degrees Celsius, temperatures in which these are tested. And so at 1,000 degrees Celsius, the olivine and the synthetic models performed the same. And so I'll just put this as an equal. Whereas at 13 degrees Celsius, the model with olivine exhibited markedly reduced viscosity. So in this case, olivine, the viscosity went down, whereas the synthetic counterpart didn't go down as much, right? And so if that's the case, when we look at the answers, we want to pick something that essentially says that at higher temperatures, olivine, the real olivine, exhibits reduced viscosity compared to the fake olivine, right? And so when we look at the answers, that would match D in saying olivine is crucial for the reduction of the viscosity at high temperatures, which is something the synthetic model can't do as well. If we look at the other answers, A, the transition zone in Earth's mantle predominantly contains olivine. There's no evidence to find to substantiate the conclusion that's mentioned in A, and so we can eliminate A. The viscosity of Earth's mantle increases beyond the transition zone. Again, this has nothing to do with what we are actually saying when in comparing these two temperatures. And then C, the synthetic analog of olivine exhibits properties identical to those of natural olivine at 1,000 degrees Celsius. Yes, that's potentially true, but we're focused on the 13 degrees Celsius situation, and so C is not relevant to the conclusion that we need, and we're left with D as our answer. Okay, and so now transitioning to the grammar part of the module. With this first question, we see that we need to identify what kind of punctuation needs to go around the word including. And so whenever we have some sort of statement and we give examples using including, we always need to make sure that we have a comma before including. And so as a result, when we look at the answers, A would make sense. B would essentially be a situation in which we don't separate fields with the other elements here. And so it would be awkward and not make sense. And so we can eliminate B. C, we can only use a colon if the word before this colon was a noun rather than a ing verb. And so we can eliminate C. And D would be just improper omittance of a comma, and so as a result we can eliminate D here, leaving us with A as the answer. Now moving on to number 18. So here, whenever we start a sentence with a preposition like among, what that means is as when we look at the subject of the sentence, we need to look at not what happens before the verb, but rather what happens after the verb. And so the subject of the sentence would actually be the creation of the Julian calendar, which is a singular subject. And we know that because we're dealing with ancient Rome, we're talking about past tense, allowing us to pick A as the answer. C is present tense, and so we can eliminate C. And B, were, and are both past tense, and so we can eliminate, are both plural, and so we can eliminate B and D as well, leaving us with A as the answer. Now moving on to number 19, what we need to do here is we need to identify, starting from Harriet Tubman to freedom, whether we're dealing with an independent clause or sentence, and from her to history, whether we're dealing with a sentence or a dependent clause. And so we know that from Harriet Tubman to freedom, because we have the subject being Harriet and the verb being risked, we do have a sentence. And from her efforts to history, we have a subject in her efforts and saved as the verb, meaning that we have two sentences that need to be separated by either semicolon or period, allowing us to pick B as the answer. In terms of A would be a comma splice, and so we can eliminate A. C, this would be not additional information, so it would be awkward to use a dash. And D omits all punctuation, which wouldn't make sense in context and be a run-on sentence. Okay, so with 20, our immediate indication of what the answer is should be found in looking at the fact that we have a dash here. And so if you have a dash in the middle of a sentence, what that normally means is we need to have another dash, right? And so what we have here is this mathematician. And so we have two answers with dashes in them. One is programmer dash and one is programming dash. We know that she is a computer programmer, not computer programming, and so we know that A must be the answer here, allowing us to eliminate B. C and D would not address the fact that we have this first dash standing by itself, and so we can eliminate C and D as well, leaving us with A as the answer. Moving on to 21, the question that we need to look at here is what is the subject of the sentence? And we know it is the Great Barrier Reef. And so this reef, we know being singular has to be either is home to or has been home to, given the fact that C and D are plural. And so has been home to and is home to, if we're debating between those two options, and we know that the Great Barrier Reef is still present today, just using is home to is a more natural, more succinct way of expressing what we need to say. And so A would be the answer and B would be not as good of an answer. Now moving on to 22, So here it talks about how this woman, Mary Curie, was the first person to win Nobel Prizes in 2 different scientific fields, and then those 2 scientific fields are mentioned here. So when we look at the various options here, the option that would directly basically answer the question of what are these 2 scientific fields would be physics and chemistry. And so the way we use a dash is if we have some sort of list or where we specify elements that were mentioned before the dash. And so A would be the correct answer here. In terms of B, using a semicolon would imply that we need to have an independent clause following the semicolon, and that's not true here, so we can eliminate B. Looking at C, such as physics and chemistry would imply that these are only examples of the fields and there are more fields, but we know that there were only 2 fields that were being discussed, and so we can eliminate C as our answer. Moving on to D, there needs to be some sort of punctuation here, and D doesn't list any sort of punctuation, and so it would be incorrect. Now moving on to number 23. So now we have transition questions where we want to look at the relationship among sentences. And so in this first and second sentence, we know that they're talking about the positive consequences of the Industrial Revolution, whereas the last sentence is talking about negative consequences. And because this is a direct contrast, we would need something along the lines of but, or however being the answer. In terms of C, we're not talking about a cause and effect relationship, so we can eliminate C. In conclusion, or when we summarize what was being discussed in the text, that doesn't match what the purpose of the last sentence is here, and so we can eliminate B. A is not necessarily introducing new information as much as it is also talking about the negative consequences versus the positive consequences. And so if, however, were not an answer, moreover would be potentially an answer here, but however, more directly establishes the fact that we have a contrast. And so moreover, rather than moreover, however would be a better option here. Okay, so with 24, what we are doing here is we're looking at the human brain and the fact that it consists of billions of neurons that communicate through electrical and chemical signals. And so as a result of these neurons that communicate through electrical and chemical signals, we have these new insights into the brain's structure and function. And so when we look at the various answers here, despite this would signal some sort of contrast, and conversely would be the same, so we can eliminate C and A. And D would also be true, right? So in comparison is when we compare A and B. And so we're left with as such, or when we sort of give the consequence of something that was previously being said, and so as such would be our best answer here. Now looking at number 25. So we have this Sistine Chapel, and they talk about the ceiling depicting scenes from the book of Genesis. And then on the wall, there's also this Last Judgment portrayal. And so these 2 things, while both have to do with the Sistine Chapel, are not directly related. So when we look at the answers here, it's not a cause and effect relationship, so we can eliminate D as a result. Contrarily, we're not talking about opposites, so we can eliminate C, on contrarily or on the contrary. Subsequently, we're not dealing with time and the fact that something was done after another, and so we can eliminate A, and we're left with B in addition as our answer here. Moving on to 26. So here it says the student wants to discuss the consequences of plate tectonics. And so without even looking at the bullets, let's see which ones talk about the consequences. And so we can see that A, plate tectonics is a theory that explains the movement of the Earth's lithosphere. And so A, rather than dealing with the consequences, is talking about essentially what is plate tectonics. And so we can eliminate A. Looking at C, plate boundaries in the theory of plate tectonics can be classified into 3 types. This is talking about the types of plate boundaries rather than the consequences of plate tectonics, and so we can eliminate C. Looking at D, convection currents in the Earth's mantle drive the movement of tectonic plates, leading to the formation of geological features and the occurrence of natural disasters like earthquakes and volcanic eruptions. Let's keep that as a potential answer here. Let's look at B. The movement of tectonic plates causes various geological events such as earthquakes, volcanic eruptions, and the formation of mountains as a result of interactions at divergent, convergent, and transform boundaries. So we look at B versus D. B is far more specific as to what are the actual potential consequences in terms of also examples. And so more so than D, B would be a better direct answer to the student's objective. Now finishing off with 27, says the student wants to convey the peculiar circumstances and the mystery surrounding the incident. And so the key word that we want to look at here is the fact that it says peculiar circumstances and the mystery. So when we look at A does not specify what the actual mysterious circumstances were, and so we can eliminate A. Looking at B, C, and D, D looks tempting as an answer, given the fact that it says the hikers tore their tent from the inside, but that's only talking about one circumstance rather than multiple circumstances, and so we can eliminate D. In terms of B versus C, again, C doesn't specify how it was mysterious, and so we can eliminate C. B talks about what is the actual mystery, what are the peculiar circumstances, the fact that they had inexplicable injuries and fled their tent without proper clothing or shoes, and so as a result, B would be our best answer here.